Tuesday afternoon smelled like hot asphalt and bad decisions. I pulled into my gravel driveway, tires crunching over the uneven stone, and slammed the brakes. A pristine 6-foot white vinyl fence sliced straight through my front lawn, severing my property in half. The kicker: I'm the county surveyor who drew their damn property lines. My truck idled, the engine knocking with the familiar rhythm of a dying spark plug. I didn't turn it off right away. I just sat there, my hands gripping the cracked leather of the steering wheel, staring through the bug-splattered windshield. It was mid-July, the kind of heat that makes the horizon ripple and bends the light off the hood of a car. My air conditioning had given up somewhere around noon, leaving me drenched in my own sweat, my high-vis yellow work shirt clinging to my back like a second skin. I was 52 years old. My knees felt like they were packed with crushed glass from hiking through briar patches all day, and all I wanted was a cold beer and the silence of my own empty house. Instead, there was a wall, a bright, blindingly white wall of extruded polyvinyl chloride, marching in a perfectly straight, obnoxious line right through the middle of my side yard. It started at the edge of the county road right-of-way, cut across the gravel turnaround where I usually parked my work trailer, bypassed my rusted 1978 Ford F-150 project truck, and kept going straight past the massive 90-year-old oak tree I'd spent 3 weekends pruning last spring. The fence effectively annexed a solid quarter-acre of my land. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling exhaust and the high, whining drone of cicadas in the canopy above. I stepped out of the truck. My boots hit the gravel with a heavy crunch. I walked slowly toward the structure, half convinced it was a mirage brought on by dehydration. It wasn't. Up close, it smelled sharply of chemical off-gassing and freshly disturbed earth. The contractors hadn't even bothered to clean up. Clumps of yellow clay and pale subsoil were scattered across my patchy Bermuda grass, piled carelessly around the bases of the shiny square posts. I reached out and flicked the vinyl with my index finger. It made a hollow, cheap thwack. Anger didn't hit me all at once. It rarely does. I'm not a man given to sudden, blinding rage. When you spend 30 years measuring the surface of the earth, dealing with millimeters of variance and decades-old property disputes between neighbors fighting over a single foot of dirt, you learn to process conflicts slowly. You look for the data first. I walked the length of the fence. It was a professional job, at least in terms of assembly, plumb and level. But it was entirely, spectacularly, in the wrong place. My property, a slightly irregular 3-acre rectangle, predated the subdivision next door by 40 years. 3 years ago, the old Miller farm adjacent to me was sold to a corporate developer. They bulldozed the topsoil, named it Whispering Pines, despite cutting down every single pine tree on the lot, and built 52 identical, oversized houses on postage stamp lots. I knew exactly where their boundary was. I knew it because I was the senior county surveyor. I was the man the developers had to submit their plats to for review. I had personally verified the closure of their boundary lines. I had walked that perimeter with a magnetic locator, finding the original iron rebar pins set in 1982, double-checking the coordinates with my survey-grade GPS rover. I walked up to my front porch. Taped to my peeling storm door was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The adhesive had melted a little in the sun, leaving a sticky residue on the glass. I peeled it off, the heavy paper rough against my calloused thumb. Inside was a single sheet of watermarked paper, bearing the crest of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Dear resident, this letter serves as formal notice that the Whispering Pines HOA has enclosed its eastern easement to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the community, as voted upon by the Board of Directors on June 14th. According to our community management's recent parcel mapping, this fence sits exactly on the property line dividing the subdivision from the adjacent unzoned parcel. Any tampering with this structure will be met with legal action. Sincerely, Catherine Carmichael, President. I read the letter twice. The ink seemed to blur slightly as a drop of sweat rolled off my forehead and landed near Catherine's signature, smudging the blue ink. They didn't hire a surveyor. The phrase community management's recent parcel mapping was a dead giveaway. They had looked at the county GIS tax map online. Tax maps are not surveys. They are rough, graphical representations drawn by clerks to keep track of who pays what. Depending on the aerial photography and the algorithms, a GIS line can be off by 10, 20, even 50 feet. Every county tax map website has a massive disclaimer across the bottom, stating it is not a legal document. Catherine and her board had looked at a Zillow map, saw a line that looked favorable to them, and simply hired a fence company. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside. The house was stifling, smelling faintly of old coffee grounds and the dusty odor of dry timber. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I walked straight down the narrow hallway to my home office, a room piled high with rolled mylar sheets, topographic maps, and reference books. I booted up my laptop. The fan whirred aggressively. I logged into the county's secure server, bypassing the public-facing maps, and pulled up the raw KD file for the Whispering Pines subdivision. The screen glowed with harsh geometric lines. I zoomed in on my parcel. There it was, a bearing of north 14 degrees 22 minutes, 10 seconds east, a distance of 412.5 feet. I leaned back in my chair, the springs groaning in protest. I closed my eyes and massaged the bridge of my nose, feeling the grit of trail dust ground into my skin. They had stolen 22 feet of my land, and they had left me a polite, watermarked letter telling me not to touch it. I didn't sleep well. I spent the night tossing under a ceiling fan that clicked rhythmically on every rotation, my mind endlessly calculating geometry and angles. By 6:02 a.m., I was out of bed. By 7:30, I was in my truck, an oversized travel mug of black, scorched coffee burning my hand. I didn't drive to work. I drove to the entrance of Whispering Pines. The subdivision was a monument to manufactured prestige. A massive stone veneer entrance sign, flanked by wilting marigolds, welcomed me. The streets were wide, the grass was chemically green, and the houses were clad in alternating shades of beige and gray. I parked near the community clubhouse and waited. Sure enough, at 8:15 a.m., a silver Lexus SUV pulled into the designated board member spot. Out stepped a woman I assumed could only be Catherine Carmichael. She looked exactly like her signature, sharp, precise, and entirely devoid of warmth. She wore a tailored linen blouse, crisp white slacks, and carried a thick plastic clipboard. She smelled, even from 10 feet away, of a heavy floral perfume that fought a losing battle against the scent of dry cleaning chemicals. "Excuse me," I said, stepping onto the pristine concrete sidewalk. She paused, her eyes darting over me. I hadn't changed into my county uniform yet. I was wearing faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and my scuffed Red Wing work boots. Her expression immediately settled into a mask of polite condescension. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was thin, reedy, like a tight string on a cheap guitar. "I'm Ray Caldwell. I live next door. In the property you just fenced off." Her posture stiffened. She hugged the clipboard tighter to her chest. "Ah, Mr. Caldwell, I assume you received our notice. I hope there won't be any issues." "There is an issue, Ms. Carmichael," I said, keeping my voice low and even. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted like battery acid, but the heat grounded me. "Your fence is on my property. It's 22 feet over the line." Catherine smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile designed to shut a conversation down. "I assure you, Mr. Caldwell, the board did its due diligence. We consulted the county parcel maps. The line is exactly where it should be. Frankly, you've been enjoying a portion of our community's land for quite some time. We are simply reclaiming our buffer zone." "You consulted a GIS tax map," I corrected her. My jaw tightened, a dull ache radiating up into my temples. A tax map is a cartoon. It's a rough overlay. It has zero legal bearing on property boundaries. Our management company uses the latest satellite technology," she replied, her tone dripping with unearned confidence. "Ma'am, satellite technology doesn't override physical monuments set in the ground and recorded at the courthouse. I know this because I am the surveyor who approved the plat for your developer. My signature is literally on the document that created your subdivision." Catherine blinked. For a fraction of a second, the certainty in her eyes wavered, but people like Catherine don't retreat when presented with new information. They double down. The cognitive dissonance was too uncomfortable to entertain. "Well," she said, her voice dropping an octave, taking on a defensive edge, "if you have a grievance, you are welcome to hire your own surveyor and submit a formal dispute to our legal counsel. But until a judge tells us otherwise, that fence stays. If you damage it, we will call the sheriff. Have a good day, Mr. Caldwell." She turned on her heel, the rubber soles of her sensible shoes squeaking on the concrete, and marched into the clubhouse. I stood there for a long moment. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs, a slow, heavy thudding. A younger man might have shouted. A more volatile man might have kicked her Lexus. I just felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of exhaustion. The sheer arrogance of it, the willful, proud ignorance. I got back in my truck and drove to the county administration building. The mapping department was located in the basement, a windowless bunker that always smelled of ozone from the large format plotters and stale floor wax. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that vibrated right behind your eyeballs. My supervisor Dave was at his desk, meticulously picking the crust off a sad-looking tuna sandwich. He looked up as I walked in, clocking my expression immediately. "Who died?" Dave asked, wiping his fingers on a paper napkin. "Nobody yet," I muttered. I walked over to the massive steel filing cabinets that lined the back wall. These held the original Mylar plats, the physical, legally binding maps that dictated ownership in the county. I found the drawer for the current decade, thumbed through the heavy plastic sleeves, and pulled out the plat for Whispering Pines. Phase 1. I laid it flat on the large drafting table in the center of the room. Dave abandoned his sandwich and ambled over, looking over my shoulder. I pointed a dirt-stained finger at the eastern boundary. "Look at this bearing. North 14 degrees east. Look at the monument description. 5 8-inch rebar with a yellow plastic cap." "Yeah," Dave said, chewing slowly. "I remember when you reviewed this. Clean closure. Good data. What about it?" "The HOA built a fence yesterday. They used the GIS overlay. They put the fence 22 feet onto my land." Dave stopped chewing. He stared at the map, then looked up at me, his eyes wide. A slow, cynical grin spread across his face. "You're kidding. They built a fence on the county surveyor's land based on a tax map?" "Yep. Are you gonna sue them?" I looked down at the Mylar. I saw my own signature in the bottom right corner, dated 3 years ago. I thought about the legal process. Hiring a private lawyer. Filing an injunction. Paying filing fees. Waiting 6 months for a court, during which time I'd have to look at that glaring, white, plastic monstrosity every time I pulled into my driveway. I thought about Catherine's smug, tight little smile, and her absolute faith in an app on her iPad over the physical reality of the earth. "No," I said quietly. I rolled the plat back up and slid it into the sleeve. "I'm not going to sue them." "Ray," Dave warned, his grin fading into genuine concern. "Don't do anything stupid. You have a pension in 3 years." "I'm not going to do anything stupid, Dave," I said, walking toward the door. "I'm going to do some yard work." Friday evening rolled in thick and humid. The heat of the day hadn't dissipated. It just hung in the air like a wet wool blanket. The sky bruised purple and dark gray as a distant summer thunderstorm threatened, though no rain fell. The cicadas were screaming in the trees, a deafening wall of white noise. I sat on my front porch in a battered folding chair, a can of cheap lager in my hand. The aluminum was sweating, cold condensation dripping down my knuckles and soaking into the denim of my jeans. I stared at the fence. It looked even worse in the twilight. It was an unnatural, sterile intrusion against the messy, organic backdrop of my overgrown yard. It cut a harsh, artificial line through the natural contour of the land. I finished the beer, crushed the thin aluminum can in my fist, and tossed it into the recycling bin by the door. I stood up, my knees popped. I stretched my lower back, feeling the vertebrae grind. I walked down the porch steps and headed into my garage. It was time. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I navigated by memory and the pale gray light filtering through the dusty windows. I found my DeWalt reciprocating saw in its yellow plastic case. I pulled it out. It was a heavy, brutal tool, covered in drywall dust and grease. I grabbed a fresh, fine-toothed blade designed for cutting PVC and metal. I locked it into the chuck with a sharp, satisfying click. I grabbed 2 fully charged 20-volt batteries and shoved them into my back pockets. Next, I went to the corner of the garage and picked up my magnetic locator, a long yellow wand that looked like a metal detector on steroids, used for finding buried iron property pins. Finally, I grabbed a can of neon pink marking paint. I walked out to the property line, the real property line. I turned on the locator. It emitted a low, steady hum. I walked to the front corner of my lot, near the road, sweeping the wand over the dry grass. About 2 feet from the edge of the asphalt, the wand started to scream, a high-pitched, frantic squeal. I knelt down, pulled a trowel from my belt, and dug through the thatch and an inch of dirt. There it was, a rusted piece of 5/8-inch rebar driven into the earth 30 years ago. The immovable truth. I shook the can of pink paint and sprayed a bright, glowing circle over the iron. I walked 12.5 feet to the back of the property, dragging a 300-foot fiberglass tape behind me to keep my line true, and found the rear pin. I painted that one too. Then, I walked back up to the white vinyl fence. I wasn't angry anymore. The heat in my chest had cooled into something hard, cold, and immensely practical. This wasn't revenge. This was a correction of a mathematical error. I slapped the battery into the base of the saw. The tool instantly felt heavier, perfectly balanced. I walked up to the first panel. The fence was constructed of 6-foot-wide sections, with horizontal rails slotted into rotted holes in the square posts. The easiest way to take it down wasn't to pull it apart, but to cut the rails right where they entered the posts. I raised the saw, aligned the blade with the gap between the post and the rail, and pulled the trigger. The motor roared to life, a violent, tearing sound that shattered the evening quiet. The blade bit into the vinyl. It didn't cut cleanly like wood. It melted and chewed through the plastic. The friction generated immediate heat, sending up a plume of acrid, toxic-smelling white smoke that caught in the back of my throat. I coughed, turning my head, but kept the trigger pulled. Shriek, grind, snap. The top rail severed. I dropped to my knees, the gravel biting through my jeans, and hit the bottom rail. Shriek, grind, snap. The first 6-foot panel fell backward onto my lawn with a hollow plastic clatter. I stood up, wiped a mixture of sweat and plastic dust from my forehead with the back of my forearm, and moved to the next one. I fell into a rhythm. The physical labor took over. The vibration of the saw traveled up my arms, rattling my teeth, numbing my elbows. My shirt soaked through within the first 10 minutes. A blister began to form on the webbing of my thumb, rubbing raw against the rubber grip of the tool. I didn't stop. Every time I finished a section, I picked up the awkward, floppy vinyl panel and carried it over to the pink line I had painted. I laid it down exactly 1 inch onto the HOA's side of the boundary. I wasn't going to be accused of theft or illegal dumping. I was returning their property to their land. By the time I reached the oak tree, my arms were shaking. The plastic dust had coated my arms, sticking to the sweat like a pale, ghostly second skin. The smell of burning PVC was overpowering, a foul, chemical stench that clung to my nose hairs. A few porch lights flicked on in the Whispering Pines subdivision. I saw silhouettes in the windows, neighbors peering out into the gloom, drawn by the relentless, screaming noise of the reciprocating saw. Let them look. I reached the last panel. I swapped out a dying battery for a fresh one. The saw surged with renewed power. I cut the final rails. The last section fell. Now came the hard part. The posts. They were set in concrete. I fetched a heavy steel pry bar and a long-handled shovel from the shed. I drove the shovel into the dirt around the first post. The ground was baked hard by the summer sun. It took brutal, jarring thrusts to break the clay. My back spasmed, a sharp needle of pain shooting up my spine. I grunted, gritted my teeth, and jammed the pry bar under the concrete footing. I threw my entire body weight backward. The ground heaved and the post popped loose with a sickening suction sound. The concrete footing was pathetically small, maybe 50 pounds. The contractors had cut corners. Typical. I hoisted the post, staggering under the dead weight, and dropped it onto the neat pile of vinyl panels on the HOA's side of the line. I repeated the process. Dig, pry, lift, drop. It took me 4 hours. By midnight, my hands were cramped into claws. Every muscle in my body throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. I was covered in mud, sweat, and plastic shavings. I tasted dirt and bile in the back of my mouth. I pulled the final post from the ground near the road. I dragged it over and threw it onto the pile. The fence was gone. My land was open again. The breeze, previously blocked by the plastic wall, blew across the gravel, cooling the sweat on my face. I walked back to my porch, my legs feeling like lead. I sat down heavily on the top step. I didn't go inside to shower. I just sat there in the dark, breathing hard, listening to the cicadas slowly resume their song, drowning out the ring in my ears. I looked at the massive pile of white plastic, stacked precisely on the HOA's side of the property line. It looked like the skeleton of a cheap, modern beast. I knew the police would come tomorrow. I knew Catherine would lose her mind. I knew there would be threats, and shouting, and probably a very expensive piece of paper delivered by a deputy. But as I sat there, smelling the wet earth where the posts used to be, feeling the solid, unquestionable reality of the ground beneath my feet, I didn't care. I pulled my phone from my pocket and set an alarm for 6:40 a.m. I wanted to be awake to watch the sun rise over my unbroken property. Coffee grounds stuck to the roof of my mouth. I hadn't bothered to brew a fresh pot, just poured near boiling water over yesterday's sludge. It tasted like burnt copper, but I needed the harsh, acidic hit to cut through the heavy, dragging ache in my skull. I was sitting on my porch steps, exactly where I'd been at midnight. My forearms were locked in a dull, throbbing cramp. Every time I tried to flex my fingers, the tendons in my wrist popped in loud protest. But my property line was open. The massive pile of jagged white vinyl sat 50 feet away, a chaotic jumble of plastic and ragged concrete footings, resting entirely on the manicured, chemically treated grass of whispering pines. Gravel crunched at the end of the county road. 2 heavy Ford Explorers bearing the county sheriff's emblem turned into my driveway. They didn't use their sirens, but the light bars were flashing, casting aggressive blue and red strobes across the pale, humid morning haze. Behind them, keeping a cautious distance, was Catherine's silver Lexus. Fear's a funny thing. I knew the law, I knew my coordinates, I knew the math was on my side, but watching law enforcement park on your front lawn still triggers a primal spike of adrenaline. My stomach tightened, sour acid churning against the stale coffee. I didn't stand up, my knees wouldn't have supported it smoothly, and I refused to give Catherine the satisfaction of seeing me hobble. Doors slammed. Heavy boots crunched on the stone. 2 deputies approached, their hands resting casually near their duty belts. They looked tired, probably at the tail end of a long, unforgiving night shift. Their uniforms rumpled and smelling faintly of stale cruiser air conditioning. Catherine materialized from behind the police vehicles. She had bypassed the tailored linen this morning, opting for a tactical-looking matching tracksuit, her phone already held up in front of her face, the red recording light blinking steadily. "Hey, there he is," she barked, her voice shrill enough to slice through the low hum of the police engines. "Officer, I want him arrested for destruction of property, malicious mischief, trespassing. Look at what he did." The older deputy, a thick-necked man with graying temples and a tarnished brass nameplate that read Hayes, sighed heavily. He looked at the massive pile of wreckage, then down at me, sitting on my steps with a chipped ceramic mug. "Morning," Hayes said, his voice a gravelly baritone that sounded like tires on a dirt road. "You Ray Caldwell?" "I am." "Care to explain what happened to the neighborhood fence, Ray?" Catherine shoved her phone closer to Hayes's shoulder. "He destroyed it in the middle of the night, like a lunatic. Our management company just installed that yesterday." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the grit slide down my throat. I set the mug on the wooden decking. "I didn't destroy their property, deputy. I carefully dismantled it, and I returned it to them. It was built illegally on my land. That is a lie, Catherine shrieked, her finger jabbing at the air. We have the parcel maps, the county maps. Hayes held up a massive, calloused hand to silence her. He turned back to me, his expression flat. Ray, you can't just take a sawzall to a fence because you think it's over the line. That's a civil dispute. You're supposed to get a survey before you start destroying things. I finally stood up. My lower back screamed, a sharp, white-hot needle of pain radiating down my left leg. But I kept my face entirely blank. I walked down the steps. I didn't approach the officers. I walked directly toward the property line. I didn't need to get a survey, Deputy Hayes, I said, my voice steady, though my hands were trembling slightly from muscle fatigue. I shoved them deep into the front pockets of my jeans. I am the senior surveyor for this county. I hold the license that approved their subdivision, and I physically set the iron pins they ignored. Hayes blinked. The younger deputy beside him stopped chewing his gum, his jaw hanging slightly slack. Catherine lowered her phone a fraction of an inch. That doesn't matter. The management app clearly showed. Follow me, I interrupted, not looking at her. I walked to the front corner of the lot. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through the scuffed leather of my boots. I stopped at the bright, neon pink circle I had sprayed the night before. I pointed down at the rusted, flat top of the 5/8-inch iron rebar flush with the soil. This is the monument, I said, recorded in Plat Book 42, page 118 at the courthouse. Set in 1982, re-verified by me 3 years ago. I turned and pointed a stiff finger toward the back of the property, tracing the invisible geographic line to the second pink circle in the distance. That is the boundary, north 14 degrees 22 minutes 10 seconds east. The HOA contractors built their fence exactly 22 feet west of this line, right through my front yard. People think property lines are just imaginary concepts. They think it's just ink on paper or pixels on a glowing screen. But it's not. It's physical. It's iron and stone driven into the crust of the earth. It represents an anchor point in reality that doesn't care about apps or aesthetics. Hayes stepped closer, looking down at the pink paint and the rusted iron. He crouched, his leather duty belt creaking loudly in the quiet morning air. He traced the top of the rebar with a thick thumb. He wasn't a surveyor, but a rural cop who had worked 100 angry neighbor disputes, knew exactly what a property pin looked like. He stood up slowly and looked at the pile of plastic resting on the HOA's side. Ma'am, Hayes said, turning to Catherine. His tone had fundamentally shifted. The polite public servant indulgence was completely gone, replaced by the flat, exhausted reality of a man who realized he was dealing with someone deeply out of their depth. Did you have a licensed surveyor stake this line before you built the fence? Catherine flushed. A blotchy, angry red crept up her neck and stained her cheeks. We use the county tax mapping portal. It is an official government resource. It's a tax map, ma'am, Hayes said flatly. It literally says in bold letters on the homepage that it cannot be used for boundary disputes. If this iron pin is the legally recorded boundary, then you built a structure on his private property. He destroyed our materials, she sputtered, her voice cracking under the weight of her evaporating authority. Look at it. It's ruined. That's $10,000 of fencing. Actually, I chimed in, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. If you look closely, I didn't destroy the single panel. I cut the rails exactly where they meet the posts. The panels are completely intact, and the posts were poorly set in shallow footing, so I pulled them up whole. You can reuse all of it, just over there. Catherine looked like she was going to have an aneurysm. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked frantically at the deputies, expecting them to unholster their weapons, to throw me in handcuffs, to validate the reality she had built in her head. Hayes hooked his thumbs into his belt. Ma'am, this is a civil matter. It looks to me like Mr. Caldwell removed an unauthorized structure from his own land and returned the materials to yours. If you want to pursue damages, you'll need to hire a lawyer and file a suit in civil court. But I am not arresting a man for clearing debris off his own lawn based on a tax map error. This isn't over, Catherine hissed. She shoved her phone into her pocket, the recording forgotten. She glared at me, her eyes narrow and venomous. We will bury you in legal fees, Mr. Caldwell. The HOA has a retained firm. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Send the papers to my P.O. box, I said, and tell your lawyers to pull the deed history first. It'll save them some billable hours. Catherine turned on her heel and stormed back to her Lexus. She slammed the door so hard the tinted glass rattled, threw the car into reverse, and sped off, her tires kicking up wet gravel and tearing a patch of grass. Hayes watched her go, shaking his head. He looked back at me. A small, grim smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You got stones, Ray," he muttered, adjusting his vest. "I'll give you that. But she's going to be a thorn in your side until the day you die." "I deal with thorns for a living, Deputy," I said. Hayes chuckled, a dry, coughing sound. They climbed back into their cruisers and drove away, leaving me alone with the quiet morning and the massive, ugly monument of plastic. The legal papers never came. I spent the next 3 weeks waiting for the heavy, certified envelopes to arrive in my mailbox, dreading the inevitable march to the courthouse, but they never materialized. I found out later, through a guy at the county planning office who drank with the HOA's management rep, exactly what had happened. Catherine had taken her crusade directly to their retained law firm. She demanded a lawsuit, demanding I be held financially ruined. The lawyers, doing what lawyers actually do, pulled the physical deeds and the recorded plats. They saw my signature on the Whispering Pines subdivision map. They realized the HOA had bypassed a physical survey to save a few $100, relying instead on a free internet map. The firm drafted a very expensive memo explaining that not only would they lose a trespassing and property damage suit against me, but I actually had grounds to sue the HOA for the cost of restoring my lawn and compensating for the unauthorized use of my land. The board quietly voted to drop the issue. Catherine was furious, but even she couldn't argue with a firm charging $300 an hour to tell her she was entirely in the wrong. Of course, they didn't apologize, and they didn't clean up the mess right away either. For 2 solid months, the pile of white vinyl and jagged concrete sat exactly where I had dropped it. It became a monument to suburban hubris. The brutal summer heat beat down on it. The bright, pristine white plastic quickly became coated in a layer of yellow pine pollen and gritty road dirt. Weeds, tall aggressive crabgrass, and thorny blackberry brambles began to weave through the hollow rails, reclaiming the artificial structure for the earth. My yard, however, began to heal. The deep, ugly gouges I had made with a shovel when prying up the posts slowly softened as the heavy summer thunderstorms pounded the clay back into a solid mass. I bought a bag of cheap fescue seed and scattered it over the bare spots. It grew in patchy and uneven, a slightly different, wilder shade of green than the rest of the lawn, but it was growing. I wish I could say the whole ordeal left me feeling triumphant. I wish I could say I felt like a cinematic hero who had slayed the dragon and defended his castle, but life rarely feels like a movie. Mostly I just felt tired. The muscles in my lower back twinged every time it rained, a lingering, painful souvenir from lifting those concrete footings in the dark. I still had to look at Catherine's identical beige house through the trees. I still had to hear the synchronized hum of their central air conditioning units and the artificial chirp of their security systems echoing across the property line. I had won the battle over 22 feet of dirt, but the subdivision was still there, a creeping, inevitable tide of development pressing against the edges of my quiet life. Late one Tuesday evening in September, the air finally carrying the crisp, dry edge of approaching autumn, I sat on my porch. The cicadas were dying off, their deafening roar replaced by the softer, rhythmic chirping of crickets in the tall grass. A heavy diesel truck pulled into Whispering Pines. I watched through the fading light as a junk removal crew backed up to the property line. 4 guys in high-vis vests hopped out and began tossing the dirty, weed-choked vinyl panels into the back of a rusted dump trailer. The smell of rich, choking diesel exhaust drifted over my yard. They grunted and cursed, struggling with the concrete blocks, entirely unaware of the petty, ridiculous history of the garbage they were hauling. It took them less than an hour to clear it all away. When they drove off, the property line was completely bare. Just a subtle, invisible transition from my shaggy, imperfect grass to their chemically treated turf. I walked out to the yard. The ground was cool beneath the worn soles of my boots. I stopped at the base of the massive oak tree. The bark was rough and deeply ridged beneath my fingertips, solid and ancient. I looked up into the canopy, the leaves rustling softly in the wind, untethered and unblocked. There was no fence. There was no wall. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of dry leaves and damp earth. I closed my eyes. The world was still loud, still encroaching, still full of arrogant people wielding clipboards and digital maps. But right here, on this specific set of coordinates, the math was correct, the line was true, and the dirt was mine. If you found yourself rooting for the Surveyor and love this deep dive into neighborhood drama, smash that like button and make sure to subscribe. Have you ever had to deal with an overstepping HOA or a nightmare neighbor crossing the property line? Drop a comment below and share your wildest stories with the community. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who appreciates seeing arrogant authority put in its proper place. I'll see you in the next one.